Good afternoon, everybody. So pleased to see everybody here for this final keynote session of this year's conference. I'm Annie Anderson. I'm Professor of Public Health Nutrition at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Barry Popkin to address our conference. Now, Distinguished Professor of Nutrition at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Public Health, with an academic career that started with a doctorate in agricultural economics from Cornell, and from there developed an interest and expertise in a huge range of topics very dear to our heart. So nutrition and physical activity patterns, programs and policies that address nutrition-related NCDs, obesity challenges and all the different and many dimensions of assessing, measuring, doing something, interventions at big policy level, thinking local and thinking big, and of course, nutrition transition. So Barry's received many awards and recognition for his areas of expertise. And I'm just going to read out some of them because I don't think I've ever met anybody with quite so many awards in this field. So they include the election of fellowship from the American Society of Nutritional Sciences, the UK Rank Prize for Science. He's an elected fellow of the Obesity Society, the Mickey Stunkard Lifetime Achievement Award, the Gokoplan Oration Award from India, Chinese Government Awards, and the World Obesity Federation Population Health Sciences Award. Truly an international researcher, a leader in his field, and we're absolutely delighted that this afternoon Barry will talk about the nutrition transition, programs in low and middle income countries, current policy and regulatory activities in nutrition-related health disease. Barry, can I welcome you to the stage, please?
Hi. You actually may not know it, but I think in the first or second year of this meeting, I also gave a plenary. So it's been a long time. This group has really grown from the couple hundred that started this, and I'm really honored to be here. So what I'm going to try to do today is kind of give you a sense of where we are today in the world, and you know it probably more than I can say it, but as you know, not a single country in the world has reduced overweight and obesity, and we're at a very difficult period of continued increases in overweight, and I'll talk about some of that and some of the related issues. I'll speak a little bit about some of the nutrition drivers. I'll hardly speak about the physical activity drivers because you've had so many sessions on it here, and I'm focused much more on diet change on the global level right now. And then I'll speak about some of the things going on around the world that countries are doing. You can give you a sense of how quickly the globe has begun to think about what we can do to create healthy lifestyles, and then where we have to go in the future to kind of create that global norm of healthy living. So to begin with, I'll talk a little bit about undernutrition and overnutrition and some about each of these topics here. I won't speak much about adolescence because it's a very complex topic in the low and middle income world with a lot of intergenerational complexities. I want to begin by just showing you this. This is from long-term trends. We're taking a series of nationally representative surveys for low-income countries across the globe to show you with the green bars at the bottom the percentage change on an annualized basis in prevalence of stunting. So you can see that globally we're beginning to deal with stunting. Now, we will suffer for the next 20 to 40 years from the effects of stunting and fetal undernutrition in terms of the risks to NCDs and visceral obesity and all the other related issues, but we're making progress. We have at the same time in the low and middle income world shifted over, so more and more overweight. As we get darker and darker, it's over 40%. And then the next one, when we move up to the 80 and 100% levels, you can begin to see how the overweight and obesity is shifting across the globe as we get darker and darker colors, so that we're beginning to see no countries left with under 20% overweight. And we're seeing across the globe, on adults at least, that kind of level of overweight in every country in the world. That's quite an amazing shift if we think about from the 90s, when we still had a lot of hunger and starvation, to the point where we're moving on 2.5 to 3 billion overweight and obese individuals. And one issue about that is equity. On the right will be a greater increase on an annualized basis in the proportion, the prevalence of overweight in a country, so these among the poor. So these countries in the low and middle income world, including Indonesia, China, all of Latin America, the Middle East, and much of Southeast Asia, these countries, the poor are now overweight, and it's growing that much faster per year, the overweight prevalence of the poor versus the bottom quintile versus the top quintile. In contrast, South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, other than South Africa, we're really seeing it's still a problem of the rich. But in 20 years, with wealth increasing the way it is, it will shift, and it will be a problem of the poor globally. So when we think of overweight and obesity, and we think of the increasing prevalences in the low-income world, much like the high-income worlds we live in, the rates of change are much greater among the poor, and we have to begin to think first about that, and everything we're doing has to keep that in mind when we think of equity. The last thing is, you hear a lot about the double burden of obesity, malnutrition. It's something that we first wrote about, many decades ago. And the reality is that Latin America was the center of it, and there was some in South Asia and in Central Asia in the early 1900s. Today, it's a sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia issue, along with Indonesia. So India, Indonesia, and sub-Saharan Africa are the major regions and countries where the double burden of malnutrition, with high levels of undernutrition, and particularly only stunting really is a major one, or thinness in women, and overweight and obesity are joint problems that we still face with. But increasingly, the causes of the undernutrition are the same as the causes of overweight. And the world has joined in the sense that the global food system that I'll talk about in a minute is really reaching every corner of every country and every village in the world. Lastly, I want to just use this to show you, again, this is the countries that in the last 20 years became double burden countries. And this is the countries that stopped being double burden countries. And they're under different circumstances than if you can read it, but double burden at different levels of overweight and obesity at the national level. But the point is, you can see that the countries that have become a double burden are the poorest bottom quartile. So what's happened is we've made it cheaper to become heavy and fat. We've made overweight and obesity a cheap issue by the penetration in the world with kind of colossal amounts of cheap, ultra-processed foods and beverages. And that is what is behind this shift. So it used to be the countries that used to be the high double burden and no longer were the high income, and the countries becoming it are the low income countries. And that is very important also to understand, to begin to get a sense of the kind of dynamics of the food system globally. Lastly, one thing that we don't talk about here, and we don't talk about very much, but we should be aware of, is that in every country I've looked at where I had nationally representative surveys in the, let's say, 10 years or 15 years apart that had waist circumference as well, we looked at them, and this is just taken using complex multivariate work, showing at a BMI of 25 the difference in waist circumference. And essentially, in every country I've looked at this, much more than this is just from one publication of a few years ago, we find waist circumference for the same level BMI at the same age going up. We are essentially gaining visceral fat relative to other fat globally. And that represents an even more dangerous situation in terms of health than just thinking of overweight, thinking of energy balance, and so forth. So keep all that in mind. And then keep in mind this last slide. This is two endocrinologists. The one on the left is Yudkin, John Yudkin, who's a British endocrinologist. The one on the right is Yadav, Dr. Yadav from India. Both endocrinologists. Look at their BMIs are identical. Look at the proportion body fat. And then look at where the body fat is in my Indian colleague, and look at where it is in my British colleague. You can see the visceral fat and the level of fatness. This is the kind of genetics that non-Hispanic whites across the globe don't have. We are like John Yudkin. The rest of the world is increasingly more like Dr. Yadav. And this is a critical kind of issue. The fact is that the standards of BMI, the way we think about it comes from US, UK, European research, but the reality, Australia and New Zealand, but the reality is the rest of the world is getting diabetes and hypertension at BMIs of 21, 22, 23, and we're getting them at 25 to 35. So that the relative risks at lower BMI levels is far more important in the low and middle income world than that measurement is of overweight in the high income countries. And you've got to keep that in mind. So what will I talk about a little bit? I'll talk about each of these drivers in a sense. I won't go in great detail to show the whole literature between each of these issues. But what we're talking about is evolution has given us a set of preferences, and the last one on the bottom was given us by the food industry in the last century, but not created through evolution. But we've clashed with modern technology, and each of them is part of the reason that from the diet side or the activity side, we are where we are today with the kinds of diets we have, with our high sweetness preference, our thirst and mechanism being separate from our food and hunger mechanisms, and our fatty food preferences, our desire to cut our activity, and now snacking constantly. And I won't talk much about physical activity. The reason is we've really reduced it, and we've reduced it for good reasons. But you understand, everybody in this room, how difficult, how critical to health physical activity is, but at the same time, how difficult it is to offset a Coke or offset any kind of ultra-processed food by running or walking it off, and how difficult it is to get people to do the kind of strenuous exertion that we truly need to have aerobic health. So this shows you where we had followed, we continue to follow, but I haven't updated this slide since 2009, I apologize. But these are, in yellow, the physical activity in METs measured very carefully for tens of thousands of Chinese adults, where we asked about each occupation, what they stood, they sat, what they lifted, what they did during their occupations. We did the same in home production, all aspects of home production, time use and other questions, and did the same for transportation and leisure. And in each of those four categories, the change, even though it doesn't look big on that slide, has led to at least a doubling in the risk. The reduction in each of those activities over time, at least to a doubling of the risk of overweight and obesity, and increased risk of overweight. We've shown introduction of people getting cars or motorcycles, what that's done. We've shown the same for occupational work and so forth. And it's just an example where you can follow a country moving through so quickly the transition from a very high METs, not quite down to the METs level of 150 to 70 that you would have in the US if you ignored sleep and kind of the unmeasured kind of activities, but really moving very rapidly downward. And that is what's happened across the globe as we've introduced modern technology in occupations, in services of all sorts. We've introduced transport, we've introduced it in home production, we've introduced it throughout our lives, and it's traveled the globe through kind of the way we've opened up the transfer of technology across the globe, so that the way we move and the way we exert ourselves is becoming globally much, much more comparable to the way we move and sit and not sit in the US and UK and Europe and Australia and New Zealand and the higher income world. So we move to the evolution of food, and we think about how we've moved in our food system. And this is just kind of a simple slide to kind of bring us through the millennia of changes in food supply. And it's really in the last post-World War period that we've made a major revolution in how we eat. And it's not necessarily a revolution that we're beginning to learn, as scholars are showing us. It's a very healthy one. As we've moved toward ultra-processed food with a high level of additives, smells, flavors that really induce different levels of satiety and so forth. So this is kind of an oversimplification of a much more complex process. And I'll talk through a few of the major components very briefly, but you're aware of all of these. You've studied them in each of your countries, and but it's a global change. It's not a change just in Europe or the US or Australia and New Zealand. It is a change across the globe. Every country is going through this. Every low-income country, and systematically, first in the urban areas and then in the rural areas. So I'll go through each one of these. And you can kind of get a visualization of this just thinking of the kinds of trends and how rapidly we're speaking. And we're speaking, each of these are slides taken 4 or 5 years apart in the same areas. We're just going that quickly. And so the first one is sweetness. And very few of us don't have a high sweetness preference. We may not eat a lot of sweets if we're really controlled, but generally sweetness preference is, in most of the population, fairly positive. And we needed it for fruits and berries to survive in an evolutionary sense. But then all of a sudden, at the same time, we needed water to live. And you all know, many of you know, that if you don't drink water for 3 to 7 days, you'll die of you'll just die. You need to have water constantly. But food was intermittent. There were seasonal availability of food throughout our evolution. And so for some reason, we have an uncoupling of what we eat from what we drink. We don't know why. We know you can live for months on your body fat, and you may not think that, but I've certainly seen it in a partner of mine that lived for 2 months without eating, and before she passed away. So it is a reality and these two got uncoupled. So what we drink doesn't affect what we eat. Now that's okay if we drink just a little bit of sugary beverages and maybe you put a teaspoon of sugar in your coffee. But if you're like most of the world and the top 20, 25, 30% consume very high levels of sugary beverages and sugar in general in beverages, it's very impactful. And that's what we're seeing in country after country. This is just from Mexico, but I could show it in any country. There's a huge maldistribution. It's not the mean that counts. It's that 20 to 40% who are consuming most of the sugary beverages in each of our countries that really matters. And here is kind of where we're going with that. I'm sorry something happened, and this is usually automated, but not here. Then we cross through. But the reality is we've moved across to an era where the beverages have moved from being water to being sometimes alcoholic beverages of various sort, and then later tea and coffee, and then later sugar in the tea and coffee, and ultimately sugary beverages and every kind of sugar we have. But it's not only in our beverage supply. We went through the several million foods that we have with all the ingredients in the U.S. food supply in the last 20 years, 15, 17 years. In this one paper we showed, as is seen here for the foods, that about 2/3 of the foods in the U.S., and probably the same across Europe probably the same across most of the high-income countries, and increasingly, certainly the same in all the low and middle-income countries where we're working, have sugar added to them. Not diet sweeteners. It's new to food. It's going to be coming, believe me, as with all the reformulation we're going to see. But it's certainly in beverages, and we're going to get a lot more of that. But this just shows the amount of sugar with the dark red, that's the caloric sweeteners that are in our foods. And there are hundreds of them. So I don't need to give you more information on that, but I just want to remind you it's not just that we're eating sugar and drinking sugar, we're also eating it constantly. And it's part of the things that it has many properties, but some are good and some are not in terms of food preparation, but clearly it's not good for our health. Snacking is an interesting one. You may not know it, but we didn't snack 100 years ago. There's no evidence beyond a little bit of street food in any kind of study or paper that people snacked before 1900. They had snacks in special festivals, a Chinese New Year, other kind of festivals like that. They had street food, but we did not snack. Snacking is something that began post-World War II and has increased. So in most of our countries, it's a quarter or more of our food intake. And that's true not only in the US and Brazil, Mexico, Chile, every country as we study with diet data, it's the same. China, where we began, they didn't snack at all. We saw first then a little bit of fruit was used as a snack, and now we're seeing every 2 or 3 years in our surveys there, very detailed surveys, snacking is doubling, tripling, and it's becoming chips and all the kinds of lovely ultra-processed snack food that we're having across the rest of the world. We're changing the way the world is eating with our marketing and all the other kinds of things going on. And this is a global, from Euromonitor data for around 90 or 100 countries, just a regression showing with income up, you can see the snack food sales in grams per capita per day, and you can see the annualized increase, and you can see as countries go up in income, how it goes up. And this is just an example. And here's another way to look at it in terms of grams per capita from the kinds of snack food, which will vary by country. Often grain-based desserts clearly is one of the leaders, but depending on the country, you'll have other kinds of snack food. But it's increasing. Look at China. This is what's happening with our food industry. They're moving to the third world because we're not growing and buying more of our snack food. So clearly the new targets are every country in the world other than in the high-income countries. Thirdly is edible oil. You may not think of this as such an important issue because it's really been we've had olive oil in Europe, and we've certainly had cheaper vegetable oils in Europe and the US and Australia and New Zealand since the 60s. But in the low and middle income, this got introduced in that world between the 80s and 90s in the last decades. And it's gone up to be a huge proportion of the calories of many countries. Many countries in Asia, for example, have between 50 and 25% of their calories just coming from vegetable oil. Not fat, I'm just saying just from vegetable oil. So, and deep frying, which didn't exist in China really except on special occasion. Now, we have 60% of the households in our China survey deep frying at least 30% of their calories every day. So it just gives you a sense of another aspect of how the world is changing in terms of cooking behavior. So we have other behaviors we know about. We're losing what we really want. We have, at the same time, fast food and food service sales in general really exploding across the world, depending on the country. You can see here in billions of dollars the kind of sales growth in countries. And I'm not going to go in much detail food system stuff. I've written about it, many others have, and we talk about big complex food systems, except to talk to you that it's changed. The food system that in the 1950s and 40s was run by our government. It's now increasingly run directly between large corporations, be they agribusinesses like Archer Daniel Midland or Cargill or Bunge or others, to food retailers, the Carrefours of the world, the Walmarts, food manufacturers, the Nestle's, Danone's, PepsiCo's of the world, and restaurant chains, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so forth. They directly contract with farmers. They buy from them. They get to the market, and they control the food supply increasingly. And it's truly changing the kind of food we eat. The amount of food that's packaged and processed in every country is exploding. There's not a country in lower middle income world where we haven't seen a growth of 5 to 15% a year in the sales of retail sales now in the low and middle income countries from modern retail sector kinds of food, packaged processed foods. So what do we do about it? We have several things that are being done about countries are doing. Countries are doing taxes. You certainly know about it if you're in the UK. If you're in a bunch of other countries that are fighting it tooth and nail, you know about it. If you're in Australia and New Zealand and you have governments not quite willing to go along with you, we are doing other kinds of regulatory things. It's very difficult to evaluate these. We are starting to see evaluations. Often it's based on using the country as their own control, as was shown in the first symposium on the first day by evaluations from Philadelphia, United Kingdom, other places. Oakland, I think, was one shown in symposium on that day one. But the point is that we use the country as their own control, and we use the trend in the country. And in Mexico, the first country with a large-scale evaluation, we found an important, significant decline in the first and the second year. And most importantly, we found a much bigger decline among the poor than among the rich. And which is very important because in Mexico, double the levels of overweight and obesity among the poor, but more importantly, untreated diabetes, untreated hypertension, poorly diagnosis, very few diagnosed in the case of diabetes. So it's a public health intervention. It's progressive from a public health point of view. It may be regressive as economists talk about it, but from a public health point of view, taxes that impact the poor the most and cut the unhealthy foods, and in Mexico's case, they shifted to water, were very important. Mexico also did a junk food tax, a little different than the one in Hungary, and also had equally significant reductions in unhealthy food and some increases in healthy food. So we went from a couple of countries 5 or 8 years ago with taxes to the point now where across the globe we have over 40 countries with a sugary beverage tax. We have them in the Americas. We have them in Europe and North Africa. We have them in sub-Saharan Africa and low and middle income countries. And we have countries across the globe considering them. So if you think about taxation, you think of tobacco. The first tax in tobacco, it took at least 60 years before you had 40 countries taxing. So if you think of how we've compressed the amount of time going from 1 or 2 countries up to over 40, it's really quite rapid. The communications, the politics, the needs, the health costs of this are really affecting the world, and we've moved pretty quickly. That doesn't mean this, we know this isn't the answer. We know it's just one little piece of a pie, but it's important. The next piece is one that you haven't talked about much here, which is warning labels on food. Clearly, people here have been talking a lot about Australian stars, Nutri-Score, traffic lights, all approaches the industry loves. In fact, in every country I'm working that is trying to put in the warning label, the industry's been trying to either put in traffic lights, Nutri-Score, or the GDAs, or the Australian approach, because they love them, because they don't impact behavior. But this Chilean approach, following the tobacco model of putting warning labels saying it's high in a food product, and at the same time using that same warning label to not allow the foods in schools, to start using them for banning marketing in the country, taking any food that had a warning label on it, they couldn't have a character, no Tony the Tiger, Santa Claus, chocolate Santa Clauses didn't have a picture of Santa Claus on them, whatever it is, you lost that character if you were a warning label food. Very impactful kinds of things that you can do with a warning label. And in the case of Chile, they've really, is the first country, and a series of papers will be coming out this year to show some of the effects of using this kind of approach. And I want to talk about it a little bit more. So there, they put, with a very specific amount of space required on every package for the warning labels, to put in certain places, very clear. They tested it with random control trials to figure out what worked in their country. This warning label, they have it for the added sugar, added sodium, added saturated fat, and if you have any of those added, certain high levels of energy density. Focus group results were amazing. They showed that they might be changing norms in that country. So these were done in a set of focus groups of mothers of low-income children, low-income mothers with children, excuse me, and they had things such as this, where children were coming and telling their mothers not to buy unhealthy foods. We had one girl, one of the quotes that I remember is the girl telling the mother, "Mother, you can't buy me any more of these chips. I want you to buy salads for lunch for me to take to school." Now, that's pretty shocking. But these were the more positive messages came out of the preschools cohort, the young children, than out of the adolescents. But the reality is that this is the kind of thing that can happen if you begin to hit at norms and eating behavior, which is really where we have to go. And it's where you have programs that fit across sectors, where you not just have a label by itself, you have a traffic lights here, you have a little marketing thing here, and so on, where you match across. And these negative warning labels allows you to do that quite systematically. And so it's been very effective. And one study that was presented at the symposium this morning will show that the reduction in the first year and a quarter from that law in Chile, that warning label law on the sugary beverages, along with the schools and the marketing controls, led to almost a 25% reduction in purchases per capita of sugary beverages versus a small tax that had happened several years before that in Chile, which had a very tiny effect, versus the Mexican taxes. So that you can see you can have an impact with other kinds of things beyond taxes. Not that taxes aren't critical, they are. We need to change the relative pricing of what's healthy and unhealthy. We only have these mandatory regulations in a few countries. And we have voluntary regulations in a lot of countries. And in the case of going back to warning labels, which I just want to talk about for a second, we have 4 countries today only, Israel, Uruguay, Peru, that have a law. Canada, close to having it, just needs a signature by the Prime Minister. It will have a warning label regulation. India is considering it today, and there are 4 or 5 other countries that are considering it. So that we are seeing as a mandatory law, not the voluntary kind of things that we have across Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And if they're done right, and they're done first with focus groups to understand what kind of label works well, and then if you have some random control trials to figure out, to show whether the warning label will be better at picking out unhealthy food versus traffic lights and GDAs and other things, as you'll see from 23 of the 24 RCTs done on these labels, that all the ones that asked about is this an unhealthy food or not, the warning label wins out really big time. Very much like it did for tobacco and alcohol that have been using warning labels for a long time. Clearly, we'd love to have warning labels with gruesome pictures on them, like some friends from Australia did in one trial with dental caries showing laden mouth, but that's going to be another decade or more before we get to that point. But warning labels are clearly one approach that we've shown looks to be effective. We are evaluating it in Peru, where they only have the warning label alone to see what its independent effect is. We really think, though, that crossing multiple laws is the way to go, that we really need to have multiple regulations and laws at the same time. So now for future strategies and where we need to go, very briefly. So fiscal policy is important. Clearly, taxation is important. What we haven't done yet is use that money we've used it for programs in some countries. We're using it in some countries for childcare. We're using it in others for child health programs. Many countries aren't targeting the money and just using it for fiscal resources. In any case, it helps us. But if we haven't gone to the point of thinking of taxation and using it for subsidizing food, and that's in the future, and we need to move there. We have done nothing really in a major way on the retail sector, particularly on the food service part of it. We have lots of experiments going on that many of you are doing on retail sector in a small way, but we haven't done regulatory things on the large scale, and we certainly need a lot more done on the food service sector, on the fast food chains, on the street vendors, and so forth. And we haven't figured out the kind of pricing laws and taxes and other things that we could do. We haven't done them yet. So the frontier is the food service sector and the retail sectors, to be working in them as well as just working directly through taxation and then indirectly through marketing and front-of-the-label profiling and all the sources of marketing. And we haven't really done much with figuring out how to control internet marketing. We can have laws that say you can't have it, but when the internet can cross borders and can reach adolescents, which is the key group it begins to reach and target them and individualizes it, it's a very complex issue, and we really haven't touched it much yet. So where do we want to be? We clearly want to be at a culture of healthy eating and healthy activity as well. We clearly have a long way to go there. We are beginning to learn about fiscal policies. We don't know whether the kind of system in the UK with the tiered system or the grams of sugar tax system like in South Africa is the best way to go versus just taxing by volume. We don't know what diet sweeteners means in our diet in an honest way yet to say whether going after sugar alone without going after diet sweeteners is the correct way or not. That's a big unknown yet. We certainly are beginning to learn about marketing. In Chile, in fact, an interesting experiment. For the first couple years, they had only child-directed marketing controls of children under the age of 14, when over 20% watched the TV programs and billboards and so forth. But now, as they started last summer in June, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., none of those warning label foods could be marketed. And after 10 p.m., you had to have a warning message. So what that will do for marketing, we don't know, and how that will deal with kids' attitudes, we're only going to learn. It will be several years before we can understand what the full marketing law does. But it's at least we're experimenting in the marketing area. We need to do the same in each of these other areas. We certainly know that industrial voluntary measures from all the evaluations done in every country, and I was involved in some huge ones in the US, doesn't really work. And we need regulations, we need taxes, we need lots of different work, and we need the research to support it that you're all doing and that we've all been doing for decades. And we're moving there, but you have to realize how quickly we've moved. If you come away from this pessimistic, we're getting fatter, everything's going on, without realizing what we've done in the last decade, you'd be crazy. When you think of where tobacco was and where tobacco is today and how long it took. So we are making amazing progress because all of us are pushing in each of our countries in our own ways. So this is where we have to end up, and thank you very much. And I hope that you'll see someday this last individual here. I should have a glass of water in his hands, and it'd even be better, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I've got a list of questions, but actually, questions from the floor, please. Lots and lots of food for thought there. The past, the future, what's going on now? You have a perfect opportunity to ask the expert. Okay, I'm going to wire in first. So last week's British Medical Journal had a series of articles on ultra-processed foods with various detrimental outcomes. We've already seen a whole literature now, including papers on ultra-processed foods and cancer. Ultra-processed foods are bad. We have some problems trying to define ultra-processed foods sometimes. But as a nutritionist, what I keep reading is reformulate, reformulate, reformulate. And I cannot square in my head this message of saying reformulation is going to be fantastic because many of the foods that we're reformulating are those very ultra-processed foods.
Yeah. So this is one of the critical questions our field faces today. I don't know how many of you have seen a paper that came out in Cell Metabolism about 2 to 3 weeks ago by a very eminent National Institute of Health, U.S. National Institute of Health scholar, Kevin Hall, a very distinguished young clinical researcher. But what he did there was he took a set of healthy young adults. One group he gave real food. A second group he gave only ultra-processed food, defined by having additives and supplements and a certain number of ingredients. So highly processed food only, matched in terms of food composition, in terms of macronutrient composition, protein, fat, carbohydrates, fiber, the same amount. But they could eat either ad libitum. The first group for 2 weeks was given real food and then shifted to ultra-processed, and the other group was gone the other way, from ultra-processed to real food. So each person was their own control, making it a very powerful clinical study. What he showed was something that very provocative. The ultra-processed group ate 500 calories more per day when they ate ultra-processed food than when they ate real food, on that measured, being in a controlled setting, giving food ad libitum, and vice versa. So that the ultra-processed group gained 1.1 kilograms of body weight, and we're talking about going from an American ultra-processed diet, which is pretty high, 50, 60%, up to 100%. They gained 1.1 kilograms in those 2 weeks. They lost, during the 2 weeks of real food, 0.9 kilograms. But the lipids and the biomarkers that went with it were astronomical for 2 weeks of change. So what that does is raise the question, because diet sweeteners are ultra-processed, just like as every other thing. And if you saw the paper today on reformulation, the Chilean law led to enormous amounts of reformulation. It led to reformulation, particularly in sodium and sugar, which is what the industry can do. They don't know how to deal with saturated fat yet. They have not figured that out. So very little reformulation in saturated fat. We're just going to get a ton of it in sugar. We're going to get a ton of it in sodium. Sodium, they're changing with potassium salts and so on, which may actually be to the healthy side. But the sugar side and all the other reformulations they're doing, all the fiber they're adding, that's cellulose and so on, zero health effect, lots of health negatives. So, but the Kevin Hall paper, more than these two BMJ papers, which took cohorts and followed them over time to show how eating this highly packaged processed diet, as you added to it, it increased your risks of different, we have now risks of obesity, risk of different cancers, risks of mortality, risks of CVD mortality. We have a number of these cohort studies, but they all are looking at proportions of ultra-processed, not clinical studies. This was the first clinical trial, and it is asking whether we are going, with everything we're doing, whether we need to now, what's the food industry going to do? Are they going to come back? They have not answered the Kevin Hall study. They have not said a peep about it. They haven't said, oh, we'll produce healthy ultra-processed food that you can do a clinical trial on. They haven't said anything. So this is a big question facing our field. Can the food scientists that have been creating the food supply, which is increasingly dominating the world, can it give us food that will not be obesogenic, want us to increase the consumption of it because it's got flavors and smells and additives that make us want to eat more of it? The Hall study had 500 calories more carbs mainly and fats. Didn't change the protein composition. So in answer to Anne, it was a very long answer, but I think it's a very big question that our field is facing, and I'm certainly hoping that we'll see a lot of research and we'll see clinical studies trying to understand what's going on.
Thank you, excellent. Other questions, please? Yeah.
Hi, this is Poonam Ohri Vachaspati from Arizona State University. So thank you for this wonderful presentation and your presentation earlier by your group on the Chilean policies. So my question was, is the Chilean government thinking about using these warning labels on restaurant foods? And if they are or not, I'd really welcome your opinion and thoughts on that.
Food service, would they use warning labels on food service in Chile?
You certainly, if the first thing we did was require nutrient facts panels for food service, and we can do it. If you have 6 or more food services in a country, it's very easy for them to put together nutrition facts panels for the food they sell. That case, you could do warning labels, and we don't know what it would do. We only have really trivial studies on just doing calorie labeling, but warning labels, I think, would be a very provocative issue. My favorite has been thinking about pricing and calorie pricing, and every calorie for the supersizing within each commodity, you have to have them priced with calorie the same. But that's a very good, they could do warning labels. And it is indeed an approach that could be done easily in a number of countries, because they could require for chains nutrition facts panel data, and they could require warning labels then. So very good point.
Have we got another question here? Yeah.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I didn't attend your presentation this morning on the Chilean project. I was just wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit about how political will was generated for that project.
Well, my Chilean colleagues in the audience could do a much better job than me, but this was a 10-year process in Chile. It was a process of first getting a group in the Congress, led by a very distinguished Senator Girardi, getting a group of congressmen together, working diligently over a long period of time with the Ministry of Health. They had an academic cluster that supported this, but they did not have civil society in Chile. Despite that, building and educating this cluster in Congress, having a consistent Ministry of Health for around 6 years, they were able finally to get the law passed, and then it took several more years to write the regulations behind the laws to create the profiling system and so forth. So it was done uniquely. It's done so differently than we're seeing getting the taxes in the UK, getting the taxes in the US, what Mexico did with civil society groups really leading the charge along with academics and some support in some cases from government and others against. Chile had a unique history.
Sounds great. I've got another question here.
Cleona Nweriku from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Thank you, Barry, for a great presentation. Chile and the South American countries are definitely leading the way, I think, in terms of front-of-pack labelling. Codex recently set up a new committee on front-of-pack labelling. I wondered if you had any thoughts to share about what impact that might have on front-of-pack labelling moving forward globally.
Well, the Codex is, for people that don't know it, Codex governs a lot of things about what's on food packages, and it's comprised of representatives from governments across the world. Theoretically, industry is not involved. Civil society and industry can be observers, but indeed, in the last Codex, we had someone from Italy write a letter before a meeting forthcoming suggesting that we ban certain kinds of labeling and only allow the GDAs and a couple others on the front of the package. So there are politics that have entered Codex, but the Codex has certain norms about not telling countries exactly what to do, trying to set certain kind of standard. And we've really got our lawyers working on this, and we have a number of countries that we're working with that are certainly going to battle and not allow the Italian approach to enter. And I'm not worried. It's just another game going on that industry got to one country representative to push something, but it's not going anyplace, I don't think. Codex has never done anything to ban country-specific laws as long as they're within the broader scope of what they want in packaging.
Another question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I was looking into your slides where I can see that there was a very largest decline in stunting in Bangladesh. And I was quite happy. But then I also see that overweight and obesity is also quite prevalent in Bangladesh. So I'm thinking that this is a country with high prevalence of food insecurity, and urban poor are really vulnerable, and there are lots of sugary foods available. There isn't much of food labeling and all those. So what are kind of realistic solution for those country in your? Yeah.
It's a very good question. So South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India are countries with very high levels of stunting still and undernutrition, thinness in women, intergenerational malnutrition from thin teenage or young wives, women becoming pregnant and having babies, and then a lot of high, low birth weight. So it's got a tremendous problem. What's entered is the modern food system. So those infants and those mothers are now also eating junk food. So getting rid of junk food won't get rid of the stunting and all the other problems. Getting rid of poverty and working on the food supply are critical. But we've changed the mantra from talking just about any food and just having a food diversity to talking about diet quality. And that means trying to get the legumes, the dals, the other things, and the vegetables into diets. And it's a big battle in South Asia. I lived in squatter area for a year in India, and I certainly understand a little tiny bit about poverty there. And this is not going to be an easy issue because it's talking about poverty and income inequality and somehow finding a way to get healthy food cheaper, the healthy real foods cheaper so that low-income Bengalis, Indians, Pakistanis all can have that healthier diet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Right, I've got a final question. So most of us that have been trained in nutrition are slowly getting our heads around the idea that we need to think hard about sustainable diets and sustainability. Every time I look at a presentation on sugar-sweetened beverages, I think, but what is the impact of that in terms of sustainability? Surely the sustainability argument in itself would add so much weight to trying to diminish consumption. And I don't know if you can comment.
Yes, that's a great lead. I don't know if you know that, but if you had a liter of Coke in the US, it would take about 70 liters of water to get that liter of Coke. If you did the same liter of Coke in India, it would be 330 liters. It depends on the source of sugar. We in the US use sugar beets, which is the lowest sugar consuming source, and some countries that use sugar cane are more efficient than others. So that's just the water footprint from one packaged processed food. We have not calculated for packaged processed food the carbon emissions and water footprints like we have for animal source food. So we all know the EAT Commission. We're all aware of cutting ruminant animal consumption, but we don't know. I'm on the group at Wellcome Trust that started an initiative to try to look at climate. We couldn't get a single proposal to start to look at the water and the climate footprint for anything other than animal source food. So one of the future issues, we can talk about sugary beverages where we have had scholars, 4 or 5 scholars have done water footprints, but nobody's done a carbon emissions footprint for that. Nobody's done it for a single packaged processed food yet. So it's part of the food supply that's very big we don't know. So to answer Anne, yes, for ruminant animals, we really know the carbon, and for the animal source foods in general, we've studied a lot about the carbon footprint and about the water footprint, but we don't know it for packaged foods. And for us in the nutrition field, it's not like we can necessarily do it ourselves, but we can get people at our universities, at our institutes who are in that area to be interested in working together to do it. What's happened so far is we've had American scholars take real foods, oats, other things, but that's not the package processing process. That's just a piece of the pie. The rest of it's all that energy used to transport it, to manufacture it, to all the chemicals, all the other things that go into the food. We don't know. The packaging, the plastic. I mean, we're really talking about something we know nothing about, and it's dear to my heart that we learn.
It's overdue. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have no more questions, so it leaves me to give you a gift. I'm not sure what it is, but thank you so much for all your time and effort and coming to us once again.
Thank you for the leading last question. Dear to my heart.
Right, before we move to the next item, which is our closing ceremony, I have some housekeeping. Very brief, but posters. If you haven't collected your posters already, please do so today before 5 o'clock, because all posters thereafter will be discarded. But let's not ask other people to discard our posters. Let's try and discard them ourselves if we don't want them, or take them away. And because we're into recycling, please recycle your lanyards. There is a box. Well, I've seen a box down by registration, but I'm sure it'll be easily found. We like to use these again or pass them on. And with that, I think we're going to move on to the closing ceremony. Are we ready? Okay, I shall leave the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you for staying. It's a huge pleasure